Chapter 13 of Hannibal. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Hannibal by Jacob Abbott. Chapter 13. The Destruction of Carthage. The consequences of Hannibal's reckless ambition, and of his wholly unjustifiable aggression on Roman rights to gratify it, did not end with his own personal ruin. The flame which he had kindled continued to burn until at last it accomplished the entire and irretrievable destruction of Carthage. This was effected in a third and final war between the Carthaginians and the Romans, which is known in history as the Third Punic War. With a narrative of the events of this war ending as it did in the total destruction of the city, we shall close this history of Hannibal. It will be recollected that the war which Hannibal himself waged against Rome was the second in the series, the contest in which Regulus figured so prominently having been the first. The one whose history is now to be given is the third. The reader will distinctly understand the chronological relations of these contests by the following table. The included table lists the dates of major events of the three Punic Wars. During the First Punic War, which lasted 24 years, these four events are listed. 264 B.C., war commenced with Italy. 262 B.C., naval battles in the Mediterranean. 249 B.C., Regulus sent prisoner to Rome. 241 B.C., peace concluded, lasting 22 years. During the Second Punic War, which lasted 17 years, these five events are listed. 219 B.C., Hannibal attacks Saguntum. 218 B.C., crosses the Alps. 216 B.C., Battle of Cannae. 205 B.C., is conquered by Scipio. 200 B.C., peace concluded, lasting 52 years. During the Third Punic War, which lasted 3 years, these two events are listed. 148 B.C., war declared. 146 B.C., Carthage destroyed. These three Punic Wars extended, as the table shows, over a period of more than 100 years. Each successive contest in the series was shorter, but more violent and desperate than its predecessor, while the intervals of peace were longer. Thus, the First Punic War continued for 24 years, the second about 17, and the third only 3 or 4. The interval, too, between the first and second was 24 years, while between the second and third there was a sort of peace for about 50 years. These differences were caused, indeed, in some degree, by the accidental circumstances on which the successive ruptures depended, but they were not entirely owing to that cause. The longer these belligerent relations between the two countries continued, and the more they both experienced the awful effects and consequences of their quarrels, the less disposed they were to renew such dreadful struggles. And yet, when they did renew them, they engaged in them with redoubled energy of determination and fresh intensity of hate. Thus, the wars followed each other at greater intervals, but the conflicts, when they came, though shorter in duration, were more and more desperate and merciless in character. We have said that, after the close of the Second Punic War, there was a sort of peace for about 50 years. Of course, during this time one generation after another of public men arose, both in Rome and Carthage, each successive group on both sides inheriting the suppressed animosity and hatred which had been cherished by their predecessors. Of course, as long as Hannibal had lived, and had continued his plots and schemes in Syria, he was the means of keeping up a continual irritation among the people of Rome against the Carthaginian name. It is true that the government at Carthage disavowed his acts, and professed to be wholly opposed to his designs. But then it was, of course, very well known at Rome that this was only because they thought he was not able to execute them. They had no confidence whatever in Carthaginian faith or honesty, and of course there could be no real harmony or stable peace. There arose gradually, also, another source of dissension. By referring to the map, the reader will perceive that there lies, to the westward of Carthage, a country called Numidia. This country was 100 miles or more in breadth, and extended back several hundred miles into the interior. It was a very rich and fertile region, and contained many powerful and wealthy cities. The inhabitants were warlike too, and were particularly celebrated for their cavalry. The ancient historians say that they used to ride their horses into the field without saddles, and often without bridles, guiding and controlling them by their voices, and keeping their seats securely by the exercise of great personal strength and consummate skill. These Numidian horsemen were often alluded to in the narratives of Hannibal's campaigns, and, in fact, in all the military histories of the times. Among the kings who reigned in Numidia was one who had taken sides with the Romans in the Second Punic War. His name was Massinissa. He became involved in some struggle for power with a neighboring monarch named Syphax, and while he, that is, Massinissa, had allied himself to the Romans, Syphax had joined the Carthaginians, each chieftain hoping by this means to gain assistance from his allies in conquering the other. Massinissa's patrons proved to be the strongest, and at the end of the Second Punic War, when the conditions of peace were made, Massinissa's dominions were enlarged, and the undisturbed possession of them confirmed to him, the Carthaginians being bound by express stipulations not to molest him in any way. In commonwealths like those in Rome and Carthage, there will always be two great parties struggling against each other for the possession of power. Each wishes to avail itself of every opportunity to oppose and thwart the other, and they consequently almost always take different sides in all the great questions of public policy that arise. There were two such parties at Rome, and they disagreed in respect to the course which should be pursued in regard to Carthage, one being generally in favor of peace, the other perpetually calling for war. In the same manner, there was at Carthage a similar dissension, the one side in the contest being desirous to propitiate the Romans and avoid collisions with them, while the other party were very restless and uneasy under the pressure of the Roman power upon them, and were endeavoring continually to foment feelings of hostility against their ancient enemies, as if they wished that war should break out again. The latter party were not strong enough to bring the Carthaginian state into an open rupture with Rome itself, but they succeeded at last in getting their government involved in a dispute with Massinissa, and in leading out an army to give him battle. 50 years had passed away, as has already been remarked, since the close of Hannibal's war. During this time, Scipio, that is, the Scipio who conquered Hannibal, had disappeared from the stage. Massinissa himself was very far advanced in life, being over 80 years of age. He, however, still retained the strength and energy which had characterized him in his prime. He drew together an immense army, and mounting like his soldiers bareback upon his horse, he rode from rank to rank, gave the necessary commands, and matured the arrangements for battle. The name of the Carthaginian general on this occasion was Hasdrubal. This was a very common name at Carthage, especially among the friends and family of Hannibal. The bearer of it, in this case, may possibly have received it from his parents in commemoration of the brother of Hannibal, who lost his head in descending into Italy from the Alps, inasmuch as during the 50 years of peace which had elapsed, there was an ample time for a child born after the event to grow up to full maturity. At any rate, the new Hasdrubal inherited the inveterate hatred to Rome which characterized his namesake, and he and his party had contrived